I will link Instagram. I'm back again. Earlier on was some sort of mistake that I've made, and it seems like I am live on other platforms as well. So, good afternoon, guys. Good afternoon if you're from the UK. Good morning from the States. I hope that you have a great day. I know it's a Valentine's Day, but I also do today my weekly feedback Q&A. So if you tune in today, I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. If you're watching a replay, fantastic. I really appreciate it as well, guys. So my name is Raf, and I'm working as a feedback coach and podcast host, and this is my weekly show, weekly live feedback Q&A. In today's episode, what's the theme, guys? To give you a bit more background, what is the theme of today's episode? Let me share with you my experience when I transitioned from being an athlete to being an employee, and what was the transition in terms of feedback. When I moved from one environment to another one, I was confused with the relationship that we all tend to have with feedback, because as an athlete for many years, I've been primed to respond to feedback in a different way, not necessarily in a different way, but in a way that it seemed natural. It seemed like it's a part of my day, and I really need to have it in order to grow. So for me, it was natural that feedback is there daily for me and is there to help me. So when I moved into an employment, I was confused because all of a sudden feedback becomes scarce. Feedback is something that people avoid to share. They respond when I share the feedback myself. People tend to respond differently. And so first thing that I try to do is I try to do everything in the same way that I was doing as an athlete and what my coach would do to me, and bring this same attitude and techniques into the workplace. And that failed. It failed because I haven't considered few different aspects. I was filtering everything through my own experience and who I am and how I like to get feedback and what's my relationship with feedback like. Turns out we are all different. So my next step was, well, I have to adjust into it now and do things slightly differently. So I started to first looking around and observing how other managers are sharing feedback. What are the techniques and what are the ways in which we should share the feedback? Because I don't know about you guys, but there was a very little feedback training that I received when I moved into management. Well, typically, we are expected to deliver the feedback and be really good at it. We've been told that we have to challenge our team when they're underperforming to make sure they're doing very well, but there is very little training about how exactly we should do that. And kind of a written rule is, well, you've got your job title and you're just going to share it. You're just going to use it as the tool. And so a few years into my management journey, I started picking up wrong feedback habits that weren't really working for me very well. I started to copying all the managers how they share the feedback. I received some training, some advice. Feedback Sandwich was one of them. I did some research on the internet. And today I can tell that there is a lot of misconception. There are a lot of wrong assumptions floating around, which are not helping us with sharing feedback and making sure that people are really receptive to it. Because here's the thing, when we're sharing the feedback, we want people to stay curious with it, right? More often than not, they're a bit more defensive about it. And so for the sake of this session, let's take a goal of making sure that our team, our people are curious when we're sharing the feedback, not in that defensive state, if you will. Typically, our assumption is that when we share the feedback, people will listen. Why wouldn't they? We have the experience, we have the knowledge to share. We know it's going to work. We know that the feedback is valuable, and we know that this feedback will make the difference to another person. And we also know that our intention is really good. So if we share the feedback, why people wouldn't listen? And the relationship is slightly different, whether we are on the receiving end or providing. And when we provide, we tend to filter everything through our intention and our knowledge that the feedback comes from the good place. So people naturally should tune into it. when we're on the receiving end, it's slightly different. So what happens when you're sharing feedback? And if you look in the past in your feedback examples, you will notice that people will respond one or the other way. They either lean forward and they're curious about it, they absorb the feedback, they engage with it, or they step back and a bit more cautious. So they're either curious or cautious. Of course, we want them to be curious. But that begs the question, what makes people curious? At what point that decision is being made? At what drives this decision? What drives this behavior? Whether people are curious or cautious about the feedback? Well, we can put it under three things that really have huge influence over that response. Think about it that way. Feedback is like that hot stuff. So okay, mistake. So there are three things that typically are happening here. Now, one is that you don't have a great deal of influence over right now, but in the long run, you can change that, can influence it. And the other two are something that you're in full control. Two factors are in full control in order to get people into that curious state. So one thing that you don't have a great deal of influence right now is the existing feedback relationship that your people have with right now. Think about it that way. Think about it, feedback as a hot stove. If your employee in the past had a lot of negative experience with feedback, perhaps work for managers who weren't really skilled at sharing the feedback and were making certain mistakes, naturally, they will approach feedback conversation with you and anyone else a bit more cautiously. Just like if you would burn your hand against the hot stove, next time you approach the hot stove, you're more cautious naturally from the get-go. The same case is with the feedback. The other two things that are really influencing whether the people are in that curious or cautious state are your existing relationship with your employees, which hugely is influenced through how you navigate through the feedback conversations. Not only that has an impact on it, but it plays a significant role. So your relationship with your team that is hugely influenced how you share and receive feedback is one thing. And the second thing is how you are starting feedback conversation. So when you start that feedback conversation, within the first few seconds, people are often already decided whether they will be curious, whether they will tune into that feedback and absorb it and engage with it, or if they step a little bit backwards, and be a little bit cautious about it. Will they absorb it or deflect it in the first few seconds? And I'll be using and sharing some examples of how it happens and what we can do differently. Now, it all really boils down to this relationship between the perception and the intention. Can you guys just give me 1 second, because something just is happening, okay? I'm really sorry, guys. I had to just attend something that was disturbing the broadcast. Okay, so let's just use the fact that our goal is to get people in that curious state, right? You have your great intention. I know that as a managers, you and me, we all have great intention because it's in our best interest to share the feedback and help another person. But intention is not enough. What happens often in feedback relationship when it doesn't go well is that there is a misalignment between intention and perception. What you want to achieve and how you want to come across is different than how people perceive your feedback. And as you're working on feedback skills, as you want to improve them, we have to start aligning our perception with our intention. because that will help not only create a better relationship with your team in the long run, but also in the real time, what will happen is that people will perceive your intention as the positive one, not as the negative one. Therefore, they will be curious. They're more likely to stay curious. So the question you have to ask yourself, if I'm on the receiving end of my own feedback, does it sound like I'm helping you, or does it sound like I'm against you? Am I with you or against you? Because we ask ourselves this question all the time as human beings in the relationship between two people. Are you with me or are you against me? We are social animals, so we're constantly filtering everything through that. What you're doing is helping me or not? So if you're looking at feedback example, for instance, your well-intended feedback that is designed to help another person, but timed poorly, will be perceived as an attempt to diminish someone else's social status. So if you criticize me in front of everyone else, and I get you've got a great intention, your feedback is valid, there's a good intention, and you want to help me. But if you time it poorly, what I will see and what I will focus on is the fact that you've just diminished my social status. You just make me look like a fool in front of everyone else. You just make yourself look good by highlighting my mistakes. So if I sense that you're blowing off my candle to make yours shine brighter, I will be cautious. So that's one of the quick ways, one of the ways in which you can look at the feedback lens and how you approach it and share it, and what are the mistakes that we tend to do that are often working against us. And I'll be using some more examples in a few minutes. What are the typical habits that we have when we share the feedback that are triggering that cautious approach rather than the curious, right? Step back versus lean forward. I already mentioned we are social animals, and if you're really looking into improving your feedback skills, you have to take it under accountability. You really have to think about it, because the fact that you're the manager doesn't really guarantee that people will listen to your feedback. And I'll speak about it in a few minutes. So when I teach on my workshops, I use an acronym called FACTS. And the last letter S stands for social status. It's hugely important for us as a human beings, but it's also hugely important when we're navigating through feedback conversations. Because if I sense that my social status is being diminished as you're sharing the feedback with me, I'll be consumed and absorbed with preserving my social status. Think about how hurtful it is when you're being excluded from the group, when you don't feel like you contribute, when you don't feel like you're good enough, right? There's a reason why we're so afraid of public speaking. Even if I picked up a topic that you're hugely passionate about and knowledgeable about, and you can talk about it with your friend for hours, the minute you're standing in front of the crowd, things are different. And what's different is that fear about being excluded, is that fear of diminishing your own social status. You are worried that people will think that we're not good enough at what we do, and that holds us back. Same thing happens in the feedback, in a sense that we want to know where we stand in this conversation. Are you with me as a manager? Or are you against me? So S is social status, guys. Now, let's just use some examples. Let's just first start talking about when we are sharing the feedback and what are the habits that we tend to use or have or pick up as we go along before we become the manager. Because I know that was the exact case with myself when I transitioned from that being an athlete into being an employee, and observing how other managers are sharing the feedback. And we tend to pick up certain habits. Now, first one is the fact that we tend to share our truth as the truth. Perhaps you've heard the advice that feedback should be two-way communication, right? So back in the days when feedback was not necessarily invented, but in 50s, feedback became a tool for managers to share the feedback. And there is this concept, this idea that on the manager, I'll share the feedback, you listen. Years later, we realized that's not the best way to do so. So now the floating advice is, well, it has to be two-way conversation. And that's true. It has to be two-way conversation. And again, as a managers, we tend to share our feedback and then wait for other people to respond to it. And we're surprised when they don't. You see, what we often do knowingly is that we are not creating enough autonomy. We are diminishing people's status, and they are not as open and willing to respond back. So when we share our truth as the truth, in the first few seconds, people will start acting defensively. And so example of that would be if you let your people that they are not committed or they're not doing 100%. When you leave no space, no room that you might be wrong or you're missing a piece of information. Think about when you're on the receiving end. If I speak my truth with a conviction as this is the truth, this is how it is. And if it isn't, if you know that it isn't, what you will do is you will start questioning my intention. Why would you say something that is not real? It often pairs up with our tendency of using obsoletes, with using a generic language. And I realized that when I was listening to my son, to my younger son, and he was communicating with me and telling me, hey, this is the best song ever. This is the worst cartoon ever. And I'm thinking, well, that is not really true. What you are speaking is you're speaking your truth as the truth, as the absolute truth. And if we take this same concept into working environment, and if we add the idea that I'm your superior, I'm above you, I'm the manager, you're below me. And if I then bring my communication habits into conversation, I say, hey, you are not doing your best, versus it seems like you're not doing your best, or it seems like you're not working to your full capacity. Just an example. If I leave no room to wiggle, and if I'm telling you this is how it is, I know that you're not committed, that's how it sounds like, then people will be defensive. And then even if your feedback is valid and valuable, it's secondary. It's secondary. Think about, rather than now from perspective of a manager, think about when you're on the receiving end. So let's assume that you have sent recently a few emails right at the deadline or past the deadline, or you turn up to work late several times. And I turn up into conversation and I say, hey, John, you're always late, or you never submit your work on time. It's one of those habits that we tend to have when we speak our truth as the truth. We're using those obsolete, this generic language. What happens as soon as I say it on your end, rather than listening to what I'm saying, you already know that this statement isn't truth. And if it isn't, and I'm sharing it with you, the next thing that you tend to do is to question my intention. Why would you say something that is not true? Now, all of a sudden, you're absorbed in the fact that I'm not there with you, not helping you. What's my hidden agenda? So even if your feedback is valid, it will be really difficult for you to make your point across. So here's my advice for you. Start listening around yourself, whether it's at home or at work, how we tend to communicate. When the feedback is being shared, can you recognize the moments when the people's opinion is being shared as the truth? Like, this idea is bad, that will not work. That's one of the reasons why we tend to act defensively. Listen to yourself. How are you sharing your feedback? Start catching yourself using always, never. Things like always and never. You never take the garbage out. We all know it's not true. Perhaps most of the time, maybe recently. But as soon as you hear that you never do something, your main focus goes on that statement. You're discrediting the statement, you're discrediting the person's intention. And that's when the feedback is not really effective. So that's one of the things that we have to pay attention. Right? Are we sharing our truth as the truth, or our opinion, and inviting people, and we're sharing it in a way that it's possible that I'm wrong, it's just my opinion, and this is what I think. Okay, listen around how people sharing feedback around you, and listen to yourself when you're communicating certain things. It's a huge mistake, huge sin to use your truth as the truth and obsoletes. If I see someone around, Kieran's asking, if I see someone around me behaving this way, how can I affect their behavior? Okay, it's a good question. There isn't a shortcut to it, Kieran. It's more of a, for me, it's more about the process. How do we make people aware that their language has a huge impact in how we share that? You see, what I tend to do is I like to put myself in a position where it's clear that I'm doing wrong, and what I'm doing is wrong, and I'm working to change it. So if I caught myself sharing feedback, my truth as the truth, I would correct myself and say, oh, my bad, I phrased it wrongly. This is how I should say. Another trick that could work really, that works really well, is being clear with your team what it is that you're working on. So Kieran, if your current development plan is, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop using this generic language, and I'm going to ask my team for help. I'm going to announce, this is what I'm working on, because I realize that I have this tendency to communicate my truth as the truth. I have this tendency to use those absolutes, even if I don't mean that. It's just a habit that I have it, and I don't want to communicate that way. This is what I'm working on. So if you catch me guys doing it, please correct me. And what you're doing in this moment is you're communicating two things. You're saying, hey, I know my flaws, I'm working on them, and I need your help. And number two, you are coaching your team that this is important to work on, but how you should also consider. So that's one way. Another way is to have a conversation around that will make it clear that this is not what always happens. So you could ask about the examples of when it does happen and doesn't happen. So if you say, hey, you've always, if you see someone communicating that somebody is always late or always does X and Y, you can just have a conversation and say, hey, I noticed that you've mentioned that person always does that, and I've seen their response, their reaction. What was your intention behind it? Or is it genuinely the case when we do that? Of course, this conversation needs to happen. However, what's important here is understanding what's your relationship with someone else. If I have a really good relationship with someone, I'll be just dead on point and straight. I would say, hey, look, when you spoke to Kieran, you said that he's always late. Well, several times, or recently, he has been, but in my experience, he tends to be really good with his timing. But how the message came across was that this is the way he is, and I could see how upset he felt about it. So really wait about what's your relationship with the person and how you acknowledge it. But I'm a huge fan of modeling the behaviors through yourself in the first place, showing and communicating to your team that this is what's important, and perhaps you're making very similar mistakes. Another thing that I like to do is, if I know I've been doing these mistakes, and a lot of mistakes are so generic and universal, we all have done them. One of the things that I like to do is to share the feedback with people and let them know that I've noticed that your communication style is something that I have been doing in the past as well, and I've realized that this is the impact of it. That sort of thing, that approach does work for me as well. So it really depends on who you're working with, but being that role model, I would say it's the very first step to start communicating and bringing to people's attention how important it is, and paying attention to how we communicate. Another thing that I tend to do as well, Kieran, is if I catch myself in the act saying, are you always, then I go, no, not always. What I want to say is this. Another thing that I do quite a lot, especially nowadays with my son, Nathan, is if I share a certain feedback, or if I do something and it wasn't out of line with how I wanted to come across and behave, what I tend to do is I walk away, I think about it, I should say it that way. What I do is I go upstairs, I go back to him and I said, hey, earlier on, this is what I've said, and this is the impact of it. I should do better. What I wanted to communicate was this. What I did is said that you always or you never do that. And that's not true. That's not what I meant to say. Is the habit that I'm working on right now. Again, a huge part of being vulnerable with it, but the impact of it, tremendous. Really, really works very well. Next tendency that we have, guys, when we're sharing feedback is that we tend to be detailed negative and vaguely positive. Now, right at the beginning of the session, guys, I've mentioned that there are three factors that really playing a huge role in order for people to either be curious and informed or being defensive. One is your lasting relationship, and the other one is how you start the feedback. So the truth part is how you start the feedback. The part of being vaguely positive and detailed negative is something that builds ongoing relationship with your team. So here how it sounds. Hey there. Somebody's joined on LinkedIn. Sorry, Instagram. So here's what I mean by that. If you look at your own examples, how you share the feedback, if you're listening around how others do that, or if you look back in how you shared it or you were on the receiving end, you notice that there's a tendency that managers often tend to be very detailed when they're sharing the challenging feedback. So when you make that mistake, your managers tend to be very detailed with it. You know exactly what you've done wrong, when you've done it wrong, what's the impact, and what you have to do to improve that. When you are receiving positive feedback, if that happens, that feedback tends to be quite vague. It's well done, good job, I'm really proud of you. Although when you do it for the first or second time, it works. Eventually, what is happening is it starts creating that contrast. And the perception about you now is different. I've mentioned about the intention and perception. And the perception about you is this. I'm going to start questioning your intention, because when I make the mistake, you are detailed. You really going at it with me, and which is okay. It's fine. It's expected to be really detailed when we make the mistakes, as long as it comes across, and as long as you are helping me to solve it, and that's fine. But you see, when I do something well, when I do something right, you're no longer as detailed. So the question is, are you with me or are you against me? Are you here to help me or not? Remember the question that I asked at the beginning. We are asking ourselves, are you helping me or you're not? And so if I reflect upon who my manager is and what's my relationship with my manager, then I'll be, he's always very detailed when I made a mistake. If I do something right, the best case scenario I get is just a pat on the back and thank you very much. Which then starts questioning your intention and why you are doing those things, which then makes it easier or more difficult when you're navigating through feedback conversations. So your responsibility as a manager is to be detailed about the both. When you're sharing the feedback, the challenging one, of course, you got to be detailed. When you're sharing the positive one, is just as important to be very detailed and specific, because that's when you will be perceived as a fair manager. And I believe that you are, but your intention isn't good enough. How you are being perceived quite often is the reality. So when you go back to your team and you're sharing the positive feedback, ask yourself, is it as detailed as it is when I'm sharing that challenging news? And you got to start aligning the two, okay? Another thing that has huge influence, and you are really in control of that, is that we have this habit of sharing feedback in the moment when something wrong happens, when people make mistakes, without really paying attention to the place, time, and your own emotional status, how you're feeling in the moment. So it seems obvious, and I totally get it. But when we are so busy in our workplace, when the pressure is high, we tend to forget that we are in control of place and time, how we share the feedback. Again, there are different types of advices floating around on the internet about how to provide feedback. You will hear that feedback should be provided timely, of course. You will also hear that you shouldn't be criticizing people in front of everyone, yes, but actually executing on it tends to be quite a challenge. So always remember, you are in full control of it, and be mindful how you're sharing that feedback. Right? Am I in the best possible emotional state to share that feedback? I've heard a very good line from Brené Brown, I believe. And the way she put it was, well, if you're not willing to sit next to me whilst you're sharing the feedback, perhaps now it's not the best time for you to share it. If you need to be across the table with someone, a bit more formal, then perhaps you're not in the best possible emotional state to share that challenging feedback. So that's a really good way, guys, to looking at it. Which leads me to another misconception around feedback conversation, and that is feedback should be delivered professionally. I've lost count how many times I've heard it, I've seen it on the internet, I've read about it, and it puzzles me. It genuinely does. I mean, I can see why that's being said, and perhaps it's because a lot of managers act unprofessionally. They are storming in and then letting people know what they think just on the spot without considering anything around. They think that, I'm the manager. I've been hired to let you know when you make the mistakes. Here I am. I'm doing so. And so, excuse me. So perhaps from there, the advice to change that was, well, you gotta be professional. Well, I've got a different point of view on that. And I think the fact that we start thinking about the feedback and behaving and using it as something that's professional actually creates a barrier that prevents us from sharing this feedback in a way that people engaging with us. If you think about your relationship with people around you at home, perhaps it's your partner, it's your kid, or your friend. At what point you think, I got to be professional when I share the feedback with my son? Or if you have a conversation with your partner thinking, was I professional enough when I let her know? Or if your partner shares feedback with you, do you think like that's unprofessional? Don't talk to me like that. We don't, but yet at work, we do. The challenge with that is we start from then onwards, we start to create the whole processes and systems that are filtered through being professional. And being professional doesn't resonate with people in the same way as being natural, as helping another person, another human being. So here's the thing. When I became a manager, my manager sat with me on a regular basis and talking about my goals, my progress, etc., and so on and so on. And initially, I was over the moon with it. I was like, this is great, this is brilliant. I'm getting some personal development. I'm having a conversation with my manager, and we talk about our goals, we talk about the progress. And that magic just gone within the first 2 sessions because there was something missing. I'll always go back to my time as a wrestler. And my coach wouldn't sit with me every 3 months and have a piece of paper and ask me certain questions and make notes and say, so about that object, you promised to do that. You said you'll deliver this, where you are against it. We tend to make it professional in the workplace. And what I realized is, well, are you here to help me as an individual, or are you here because you're the manager? So is it Raf the manager with me, or is it Raf? And so we tend to do everything so professionally that it gets to the point when I had one client from actually the part of the Europe where I'm coming from, I'm Polish. So one of the clients from Eastern Europe, I suggested a model of feedback where everyone is sharing it because everyone's expert in their own field. Everyone can see things that you don't see. Everyone can cover your blind spot. And what I heard back was, no. You let the manager know, and then the manager shares the feedback with the employees because only the manager can do that. It gets to the point that it's so professional that we're making it in a way that genuinely makes the questioning your intention, that you're not here with me to help me, you're here to do your job. So why would I bother? Why would I listen? The further implication of that are our language. Our language is very professional when we are sharing the feedback. And I mentioned earlier on when we're sharing our truth as the truth, which doesn't invite any autonomy into conversation, doesn't really invite a dialogue, although we've been told feedback should be both-way conversation. See, when I share the feedback from a professional point of view, you will hear quite often managers saying things like, I don't want you to do that. I don't want to see that again. In a bracket, because I'm the manager and I'm here to make sure it doesn't happen. And so feedback becomes something really so professional that it doesn't seem valuable to us, natural to us. And we are drawn to that authenticity. If I think about the best examples of feedback that I've received, and perhaps even if you heard it, it wasn't the manager who shared it, it was the person that shared it. Alignment between intention and perception was really there, and they were there to help you. It wasn't anything like, I'm your manager and I'm telling you to do X and Y. It was, I'm really worried about you. Here's my experience. What are your thoughts? So making feedback something that is professional is a mistake. Stop thinking about it as something that is hugely professional. Kieran says, what was the situation when you received your most challenging feedback and how did it impact you? That would have been about a year and a half ago. It was the feedback that it threw me off. And it's been a while since I was so defensive when feedback was shared with me. It was written feedback through the email. It was after a very important session that I delivered, Kieran. And it was my first time ever that I delivered to C-level executives and CEO of the company. I haven't done that before. My main line of work is to working with middle management. And I did this thing with those managers. With the C-level executives. And one gentleman shared with me his feedback that was rather crushing initially. I completely over-responded to it, overreacted to it. I allowed myself to get into the position when I was questioning that gentleman's intention. I was discrediting his feedback. I was discrediting his intention. I was focused on everything else but to understand, to listen. Fortunately, I've developed certain tools over the years that helps me to snap myself away from it and recognize when that happens. So I was able then to slow down, listen to it, and extract the value from it. However, the important part here is, if that feedback was delivered in person, the way I've reacted to it would harm our relationship. Because I was in that receptive state. I was deflecting, and it was so defensive. Yes, that gentleman made so many basic mistakes whilst he was sharing that feedback, which immediately got me into that defensive mode. So he shared his truth as the truth. He shared his feedback with a lot of generic language. And so I was questioning him over and over for the first few minutes. Now, if that happened in the real time, in the real conversation, our relationship would just worsen from that point onwards. And because more likely there would be a relationship that he's senior to me, I'm superior, again, making it professional thing. He says his truth as the truth. That's the way it is. That's my feedback for you. Then I wouldn't necessarily challenge back, or most people wouldn't challenge it back. But I would retaliate in a different way. I would walk away. I would start chatting about that leader negatively. I would underperform. I wouldn't give my 100% towards him and towards the company and towards the team, just on the back of that feedback. So when I received that challenging feedback, for me, on a personal level, it was great to experience it again, because it has been a while since I've over-responded to it, and I was able to dissect it. But my real worry is, number one, I wasn't learning. And number two, the relationship with that person was deteriorating. And that's what happens when feedback is mishandled or we're not receiving it very well. We're not learning, and the relationship between two individuals is plummeting. The trust is being detracted from it. So that was the situation that really stuck with me recently. And there are some micro examples when I'm like, but I'm very quickly able to rewire myself. It doesn't have really that impact on me, because right now, when I hear challenging feedback, I've wired myself to hear learning opportunity, lesson. I've primed myself to respond to feedback with curiosity, to lean forward, even if it seems to be very challenging, very difficult one. Very interesting example could be, it wasn't necessarily feedback for me. but it was posted on the Facebook. One gentleman posted about, I think his name is Mark Cuban, owner of Mavericks. I'm not too much into basketball, but my understanding was that owner of the particular NBA basketball club said we won't be playing national anthem before the game. And the gentleman posted that this is unacceptable. It cannot be that way. And for me, I was curious why that gentleman accused it or framed it as this is unacceptable. Because for me, saying it as like your truth as the truth, this is unacceptable, doesn't invite any dialogue. And here we are, I have different opinion, he has different opinion. And so if that would be a feedback conversation, he would say, hey, your behavior is unacceptable, then there's very little autonomy here for me. What I trained myself for right now is to be really curious, like what makes you say that it's unacceptable? By what standards? And I asked the gentleman, unfortunately, he didn't respond back to me. He said, look, I'm an athlete myself, and I'm curious why it's unacceptable to play a national anthem before every game. Because in my mind, in my experience, national anthems are played when national teams are playing against each other and when an individual athlete wins the competition. That's when national anthem is there for. For me, the idea of playing national anthem before every game is different to my experience. And number two, I said, hey, do you play national anthem before every boxing game? And how about niche sports? Do you play a national anthem before every niche sport game in your country? So for me, it's that curiosity part. It's really important. It took me a while to learn not to retaliate back or clash with the opinions. But the idea here, again, I go back to that his truth as the truth. This is the situation. We're no longer going to play national anthems before the game. And he framed it as, this is unacceptable. When I hear that, I was like, this is the classic example of sharing your truth as the truth, which doesn't invite a conversation. So again, going back to this idea of, hey, feedback should be two-way conversations, invite a conversation. If you're the senior leader, if you're my superior, and you start with the feedback or you share the feedback as your behavior is unacceptable, then don't expect me to be engaging with your feedback. There is a power here playing. So that's not what we want, right? Within the feedback. Let me just, guys, look at my notes. Probably there is a very last one, unless there are some questions about feedback. And that is asking for permission. Hold on, I had another idea to share something today. Okay, let me stick to that one. So if you go on the internet, you will find quite frequently this advice. So if you type how to provide feedback, go online, type it, and see what happens. Quite often what you find is you find this advice that you should ask for permission to share the feedback. And personally, I disagree with it. The short answer for me is this is a wrong advice. And if we follow it, then it will create more barriers for you than positives. Of course, there are certain situations and times when it's the right thing to do to ask that question. But even then, I would rather work on an assumption on the skills of being able to read the situation and being able emotionally assess if it's the right time or not, rather than asking. For one, I already spoke about a social status. At each given point, we want to know where we are sitting in a conversation, right? We are always wired for that. So just imagine, let me ask you this question, or imagine, what happens when a superior person asks his team member, hey, I have some feedback, would you like to hear it? I get you may change your tone of the voice and language is different. That's important. But in a nutshell, what we are saying is, what we're doing here is saying, hey, I'm a superior, I have some feedback for you to share. Now, I'm giving you an option, but do you really? If I say no, what would that say about me? So in that split second, If you say, hey, I've got some feedback for you, can I, is it right now a good time to share it? Or can I share it with you? What really happens is, well, you're not really giving me that option, do you? Because I'm worried now, if I say no, what will your response be? What will you think? So I'm politely going to say yes. But what's happening is another uncomfortable feedback experience that we are creating with it. So rather than thinking it's a good idea to ask for permission to share the feedback, change your goal and work on assumption and on the relationship with your team that you are always welcome to share that challenging feedback. Think about yourself. Think about your coach, like your mentor, like leader that you worked for. It doesn't matter how and when that person will share the feedback with you. It's always welcome. That person doesn't have to ask you, hey, I have some feedback. Would you like to hear it? The relation is so good that you don't have to ask for that permission. And if you're working on those relationships, you will also work on your emotional intelligence skills, and you will be able to assess if now is the right time or not. And even if every now and then you mishandle it, because you work on that relationship, because you were earning that right, rather than relying on the fact that, hey, I'm your superior, I've been hired to share you the feedback. If you work on earning that right to share the feedback and challenge people, if you build that relationship, then even if you mishandle a certain conversation, if you time it wrongly, then it will be forgiven. It will be forgiven because I know that your intention is to help. On this occasion, you didn't time it well. If you don't work on building that relationship where it's okay to share the challenging feedback, I've earned that right, and you mishandle it, people will only be thinking about the fact, yet another time you've screwed it up. I can't keep up with this. I can't work for a manager like that. But if from the get-go you say, all right, so I'm the manager now, here's the advice, ask for the permission, and I'll be working on that assumption, and I'll make it as a tool, what you preventing yourself from is building a better feedback relationship, a better relationship with the people when you are welcome to share the feedback. And here's another thing. Everyone, absolutely everyone understands that we need that feedback. Everyone understands that feedback is valuable. Therefore, everyone really need and want that feedback. Maybe they're not always behave in a certain way that they want. Maybe quite often they are dismissive, they are defensive. That doesn't mean they don't want feedback. Everyone wants to grow, guys. Everyone wants to contribute. Everyone wants to get better. We all have dreams and goals. There is no question about it. Everyone needs that feedback. So accept it, park it away. Everyone needs feedback. Now, how do I do that in the best possible way? How do I build that relationship? And how do I work on my feedback skills so I can always comfortably share it with my team? So you won't hear me if you work with me, if you work around me, if you work in the past with me, you wouldn't hear me asking for permission to share the feedback. Sure enough, I screwed it several times. I wasn't always as mindful about sharing the feedback and timing it right, especially early years in my management career. As I was implementing everything that I've learned as an athlete and brought it into working environment, that was my mistake. But I never changed the goal into, right, I'll be asking people if they want to hear my feedback, if now is the right time. I changed the goal into, I'm going to build a relationship with people, and they will understand that my intention is always there to help, and I'm always there to support. And when I'm sharing the feedback, it's very clear. They don't have to question it, that intention. Right, guys. So for today, I've covered most of the parts that I wanted to. Just to wrap it up, guys, what I spoke today about is walk away and listen, whether you're sharing, when you're communicating your truth as the truth, how frequently you are using the obsoletes. For instance, hey, you never do that, you always do this, or this is unacceptable, or why would you do that? Another thing, I haven't actually spoke about it, guys. So another mistake that we tend to do, the habit that we're picking up as a manager and as an individuals, is we tend to ask a lot of why questions. And we start in feedback conversation with, why haven't you done that? Or why did you do this? If your feedback conversation starts with why, and within your first few words, you add the word you are putting yourself in a position where it's highly likely that people will step away immediately and be cautious. Think how you respond to feedback or to every conversation when someone opens it up with, why didn't you? Or you didn't do this. Okay, not the best feedback openers, because if you do it that way, you immediately get people on the back foot. They won't be as receptive. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, if our goal is to make sure that people respond with curiosity, leaning forward, not cautiously, if you use the why and you in the first few words, people are more likely to step away and be cautious about it, guys. Okay, so pay attention to that. Vaguely positive, detailed negative. Another thing to look for, guys. Yes, it's important to be detailed when people make mistake, but it's just as important to be detailed when they do something right. If it's out of the balance, your employees will start questioning your intention, and that's not building the best possible relationship with you, which makes your feedback hard. And that's another point that I spoke right at the beginning, guys. There are three things that are influencing, impacting whether people will respond with curiosity or with defensiveness: is the existing relationship that you have with your employees, how you start the feedback conversation, and lastly, what is their relationship with feedback, which you can change in the long run, but right now there is a very little influence that you have over it. You're not responsible for the last 5-10 years of the career of your employees if they haven't worked for you, but you can start working towards it and changing that relationship, guys. Okay, so that's about it for today. If you got some questions, please feel free to share it. If not, I'll be wrapping up slowly. This week, what are the next live streams other than my next Sunday live stream? On the 19th, I'll be speaking with David Burke about leading remotely. I forgot the dates, guys, but another 3 interviews that I have. One is with Helena Boschi, who is neuroscientist, and one is with the author of the book, Feedback Book. That is really, really good one, guys. Now, I'm not a fan of many feedback books, but this book just came out recently, guys, and it's really good. I really resonate with Let's Talk by Therese Houston. And I've got confirmed a podcast interview as well coming up soon. So this is a huge one. Now, what I like about this book is that it doesn't look at the existing models and trying to rephrase them. It actually scraps everything that we know about the feedback and starts from the scratch. And that's what I love about that book. And that's what I like about everyone. And I respect when people really start creating a new feedback rule books rather than relying on the old ones, because there are so many wrong assumptions floating around. So a few interesting interviews and two more things, guys. 2 more things before I cut it off. I'm joining Clubhouse as well, right? I've got my account and I'm creating a feedback lab room, and hopefully I'll be able to create a club as well. But as I've learned with the Clubhouse, clubs are not granted automatically. You have to earn that right. So right now I'll be creating the rooms for the most of the February. I'll be there daily around 5 o'clock. I'll be announcing it every single day, guys. So that's exciting part. I'm really looking forward to explore Clubhouse a bit further. My goal is to create a room when we can all have a conversation around our feedback experiences, tips and advices, and how do we coach and develop our team, what works, what systems we have in place, what are the certain ways and approaches that we do with our people that tend to work. Because I believe we all have a thing or two to share about our own ways of developing people that we can learn and extract one from another. So I'm joining Clubhouse as well. And lastly, I'm launching my first open feedback masterclass. It's a 7-week program for managers. So stay tuned. I'll be sharing a lot more about it in the coming weeks. Thanks a lot for tuning in. I know it's a Valentine's Day. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about it. What are your thoughts? What could I do differently to improve it, to make it a little bit better? For me, the biggest challenge of those sessions is that I set myself to do them without any sort of slides. And it's an interesting journey for me. It's an interesting journey because it forces you to think differently, and it takes a certain safety net away from you as well. If you get used to have some slides to keep yourself in track and all of a sudden you take them away, that's a completely different challenge, but I love it and I'm learning from it. And that's really important, guys. So take care until the next week. Speak to you soon, guys.